What started as forgetting where I put my car keys turned into forgetting entire conversations, entire days, and eventually forgetting pieces of who I was. My name is Julie Mist, and at 24 years old, I was told by everyone who mattered most that my failing memory was nothing more than a desperate cry for attention. They were wrong, dead wrong. And by the time we discovered the truth, I had lost more than just memories. I had nearly lost everything. This is the story of how a family's dismissal almost cost me my life, and how one doctor's persistence saved not just my mind, but my future.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
The first time it happened, I was standing in the middle of Target on a Tuesday afternoon in March, holding a shopping basket I couldn't remember picking up, staring at shelves of bathroom supplies I had no intention of buying. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I tried to piece together how I'd gotten there. I remembered leaving my apartment in downtown Sacramento that morning to grab coffee from the usual spot on K Street, but everything between stepping out my front door and finding myself in aisle 7 was a complete blank. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. 2:47 p.m. I had lost nearly 6 hours. I called my older sister Emma from the parking lot, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. Emma Mist Reynolds had always been the practical one in our family, the one who became a high school math teacher because she believed in logic and order above all else. At 28, she had her life mapped out in neat columns like one of her spreadsheets. Married to her college sweetheart David, a tidy house in Elk Grove, and a 5-year plan that included 2 kids and a promotion to department head. "Julie, you've been stressed about the new job," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of patient condescension. "You probably just zoned out. It happens to everyone." But it didn't feel like zoning out. It felt like someone had taken an eraser to 6 hours of my existence. I had started working at a nonprofit environmental law firm just 3 weeks earlier, my first real job after finishing my master's degree in environmental science at UC Davis. The work was demanding, researching water rights violations, preparing reports on industrial pollution cases, attending community meetings where angry residents demanded answers about contaminated groundwater. But I loved it. For the first time since college, I felt like I was making a difference. The memory lapses started small. I'd walk into the office kitchen and forget why I was there. I'd be mid-sentence during a phone call with a client and lose my train of thought completely, staring at my notes as if they were written in a foreign language. My supervisor, Michael Chen, a patient man in his 50s who had spent 20 years fighting corporate polluters, would find me standing motionless at the copy machine, unable to remember what documents I was supposed to be duplicating. "Maybe you should take a few days off," he suggested gently, after I spent an entire morning unable to recall attending a crucial community meeting the day before, a meeting where I had supposedly presented findings about mercury levels in a local creek. But taking time off felt like admitting defeat. I was Julie Mist, the woman who had graduated summa cum laude, who had spent her senior year researching the effects of agricultural runoff on native fish populations, who had been offered positions at 3 different environmental firms. I didn't just forget things. I was sharp, detail-oriented, the kind of person who kept color-coded calendars and never missed deadlines. The incidents escalated. One evening in April, I found myself sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store in Roseville, 30 miles from my apartment, with no memory of driving there. My tank was nearly empty, suggesting I had been driving for hours. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Emma, my parents, and my boyfriend Marcus. Marcus Williams had been my anchor through graduate school. We met in an environmental ethics class during my first semester, and he was everything I wasn't. Laid back, spontaneous, the kind of person who could find joy in small moments. He worked as a park ranger at Folsom Lake, spending his days teaching kids about local wildlife and maintaining hiking trails. His calm presence usually grounded me, but lately even he seemed frustrated by my increasingly erratic behavior. "You scared everyone tonight," he said when he found me in that parking lot, his dark eyes filled with concern. "Your mom was ready to call the police." My mother, Patricia Mist, was a surgical nurse at UC Davis Medical Center who prided herself on being able to handle any crisis with clinical precision. She had raised Emma and me as a single parent after our father left when I was 12, working double shifts to pay for our education and never once complaining about the sacrifice. But when I called her that night to explain about the missing hours in Roseville, her response was swift and sharp. "Julie, you've always been dramatic. Even as a kid, when you didn't get enough attention, you'd find ways to make everything about you. Now you're doing it as an adult." The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. I had been a dramatic child, prone to elaborate stories and theatrical reactions to minor disappointments. When I was 8, I once convinced a substitute teacher that I had a rare condition that made me allergic to math homework. When I was 13, I faked a sprained ankle to get out of giving a presentation I hadn't prepared for. But this felt different. This felt real and terrifying in a way that my childhood attention-seeking never had. My father, Robert Mist, had recently moved back to California after years of sporadic contact. He worked in construction management in San Diego and had been making efforts to rebuild relationships with Emma and me. But his response to my memory problems was even less sympathetic than Mom's. "Your mother's right," he said during one of our awkward monthly phone calls. "You always needed to be the center of attention. Maybe it's time to grow up and take responsibility instead of making excuses." The judgment from my family was suffocating. Every forgotten conversation became evidence of my supposed manipulation. Every missed appointment was proof that I was being selfish and irresponsible. When I failed to show up for Emma's birthday dinner in May, an event I had no memory of being invited to despite her insistence that we had discussed it multiple times, the accusations became more direct. "You're doing this on purpose," Emma said during a tense confrontation at her house the following weekend. "You can't handle that I'm settled and happy, so you're creating drama to pull focus back to yourself." I stared at her across her perfectly organized living room, surrounded by wedding photos and carefully arranged throw pillows, feeling like a stranger in my own family. How could I explain that I wasn't choosing to forget things? That every missing memory felt like losing pieces of myself? The breaking point came on a scorching afternoon in late May. I was working late at the office, preparing a presentation about pesticide contamination in the Central Valley, when I experienced what I can only describe as my mind going completely blank. Not the fuzzy confusion of my earlier episodes, but a complete absence of thought or recognition. I sat at my desk for what felt like hours, staring at my computer screen, unable to remember my own name or where I was. When awareness finally returned, it was nearly midnight. The building was empty except for security. My computer screen showed a document I had apparently been working on, but I couldn't remember typing a single word. The presentation was due the next morning for a meeting with potential funders, people who could provide crucial support for our work protecting vulnerable communities from environmental hazards. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. In my apartment, I sat on my couch and tried to reconstruct the evening, but there was nothing, just a black void where 6 hours of my life should have been. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. This wasn't stress or attention-seeking or any of the explanations my family had offered. Something was happening to my brain, and it was getting worse. The next morning, I called my primary care physician, Dr. Lisa Zhang, and demanded an appointment. It was time to find out what was really going on, regardless of what my family thought about my motives. What I didn't know then was that this phone call would set in motion a series of events that would not only reveal the truth about my condition, but also fundamentally change my understanding of memory, family, and what it means to fight for your own life when everyone around you has already given up on believing you.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Dr. Lisa Zhang had been my primary care physician since I moved to Sacramento for graduate school. A soft-spoken woman in her early 40s, she specialized in young adult medicine and had always taken my concerns seriously. But when I sat in her sterile examination room on that June morning, describing my memory lapses and blackouts, I could see the skepticism creeping into her expression. "Julie, these symptoms could be related to many things," she said, reviewing my chart on her tablet. "Stress from your new job, changes in sleep patterns, even dietary factors. Have you been drinking more caffeine lately? Skipping meals?" I had prepared for this question. Over the past week, I had meticulously documented everything: my sleep schedule, meals, caffeine intake, work hours, even my emotional state at different times of day. The folder I placed on her desk contained detailed logs that would have impressed my most demanding graduate school professors. "I've tracked everything," I said, opening the folder. "My sleep is actually more regular now than it was in school. I eat 3 meals a day, exercise regularly, and I've cut my coffee intake in half. The memory problems are getting worse, not better." Dr. Zhang flipped through my documentation, her eyebrows raising slightly at the thoroughness. "This is very detailed work, Julie, but I have to ask, has anyone in your family expressed concerns about these episodes? Sometimes family members notice patterns that patients miss." The question hit like a punch to the gut. "My family thinks I'm making it up," I said quietly. "They think I'm being dramatic, trying to get attention." "And what do you think about that?" Dr. Zhang asked, leaning forward slightly. For a moment, I considered lying, giving her the answer that would make everything easier. But something in her tone suggested she genuinely wanted to know my perspective, not just confirm her own assumptions. "I think I'm losing my mind," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I think if something doesn't change soon, I'm going to lose everything that matters to me." That honesty seemed to shift something in the room. Dr. Zhang set down her tablet and looked at me directly. "Tell me about the most recent episode. Don't leave out any details." I described the blackout at work. The 6 hours of missing time, waking up to a completed document I couldn't remember writing. As I spoke, she took notes in a small notebook. Not on her computer, but by hand, which somehow made the conversation feel more serious. She said she wanted to run some initial tests: blood work to check for vitamin deficiencies, thyroid function, and a few other markers. And she's also going to refer me to a neurologist. Dr. Sarah Martinez at UC Davis Medical Center specializes in memory disorders in young adults. The word neurologist sent a chill through me. "Do you think something's really wrong? I mean, something serious?" Dr. Zhang chose her words carefully. "I think your symptoms deserve proper investigation. Memory issues in someone your age aren't typical, but they're not unheard of either. Let's get some data before we jump to conclusions." The blood tests came back normal. Everything, vitamin B12, thyroid hormones, blood glucose, liver function, fell within perfectly healthy ranges. Rather than feeling relieved, I felt more isolated. Normal test results meant my family's dismissive attitudes would only intensify. Emma's response to the normal blood work was predictably unsympathetic. "See? There's nothing wrong with you," she said during our weekly coffee meetup at a cafe near her school. "Maybe now you can stop this whole act and focus on your job." But Marcus surprised me. That evening, as we sat on my apartment's tiny balcony, watching the sunset paint the Sacramento skyline gold and pink, he brought up something I hadn't expected. "My uncle had something similar," he said, turning his beer bottle absently in his hands. "He was about your age when it started. Everyone thought he was just being lazy or irresponsible. Turned out he had a rare form of epilepsy that affected his memory." I stared at him. "You never mentioned this before." "I didn't want to scare you," he admitted, "but watching what you're going through, it's almost identical to what Uncle Tony experienced. The missing time, the confusion, everyone thinking he was making excuses." "What happened to him?" "Once they figured out what it was and got him on the right medication, he was fine. He's a software engineer now, married, 2 kids, lives in Portland." Marcus reached over and took my hand. "I'm saying maybe there is something wrong and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's something fixable." This was the first time anyone had suggested that my symptoms might be real and treatable, rather than character flaws or attention-seeking behavior. The relief was overwhelming. Dr. Sarah Martinez's office was located in the neurology wing of UC Davis Medical Center, where my mother worked. The irony wasn't lost on me, seeking answers in the same building where Mom spent her days dismissing my concerns to anyone who would listen. Dr. Martinez was younger than I had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with short black hair and an intensity that immediately put me on alert. Her office walls were covered with brain scan images and medical certificates, but also with photographs of patients, people of all ages smiling and engaged in various activities. "Tell me about your memory," she said, without preamble. "Not what other people think about your memory, what you experience." For the next hour, I described everything. She asked detailed questions I hadn't encountered before. Did I ever experience unusual smells or tastes before memory episodes? Did I have moments of déjà vu or strange emotional sensations? Had I noticed any patterns related to time of day, stress levels, or physical activities? Some of her questions triggered recognition. Yes, I had been experiencing odd metallic tastes occasionally. Yes, there had been moments of intense déjà vu that left me feeling disoriented. Yes, several episodes had been preceded by an inexplicable sense of dread that seemed to come from nowhere. "I want to order an EEG," Dr. Martinez said, making notes in my file. "It's a test that measures electrical activity in your brain. We'll also do an MRI to get a detailed look at brain structure." "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Several possibilities. Temporal lobe epilepsy can cause exactly the kind of memory disturbances you're describing. It often goes undiagnosed for years because the seizures can be subtle, not the dramatic convulsions most people associate with epilepsy." The EEG appointment was scheduled for the following week. The test itself was strange, but not uncomfortable. Dozens of electrodes attached to my scalp, recording my brain's electrical patterns as I lay still, breathed deeply, and looked at flashing lights. The technician, a friendly woman named Carol, explained that they were trying to trigger any abnormal electrical activity that might be causing my symptoms. During the flashing light portion of the test, something remarkable happened. I experienced the metallic taste Dr. Martinez had asked about, followed by that familiar sense of dread. But this time, instead of losing time, I remained conscious and aware while feeling like I was watching everything happen from outside my body. "Did you feel anything unusual just now?" Carol asked, studying the readout on her monitors. "Yes," I said, describing the sensations. She nodded knowingly. "The doctor will want to see these results right away." 2 days later, Dr. Martinez called personally. "Julie, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. We need to discuss your test results." The urgency in her voice was both terrifying and validating. After months of being told nothing was wrong, someone was finally taking my symptoms seriously. That night, I called Marcus and asked him to come with me to the appointment. I also, against my better judgment, called my mother. "I'm working tomorrow," she said curtly. "Besides, you're 24 years old. You don't need your mother holding your hand for every doctor's appointment." "Mom, they found something on my brain scan, something that might explain." "They found something to validate your attention-seeking, you mean?" "Julie, I work in this hospital. I know how these things go. Doctors order expensive tests, find minor abnormalities that don't mean anything, and suddenly patients think they have some rare disease." The conversation ended with her hanging up on me. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 5, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Whatever Dr. Martinez had found, it was real enough to warrant an urgent appointment. It was concrete evidence that my brain was actually malfunctioning, not just a character flaw disguised as medical symptoms. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had proof that I wasn't losing my mind, at least not in the way everyone assumed. Tomorrow, I would finally get answers. Marcus held my hand in the waiting room of Dr. Martinez's office, his palms sweaty despite the air conditioning.
I had barely slept, alternating between excitement about finally getting answers and terror about what those answers might be. The neurology wing was quieter than the rest of the hospital, filled with patients who moved slowly and spoke in hushed tones, as if loud noises might disturb whatever delicate processes were happening inside their skulls. Julie missed. A nurse called my name, and we followed her down a hallway lined with more brain scan images. Dr. Martinez was waiting in her office, my file open on her desk alongside what looked like printouts of brain scans. "Thank you for coming in so quickly," she said, gesturing for us to sit. Her expression was serious, but not grim, the look of someone who had difficult news but also solutions. "I'm going to be direct with you. The EEG showed abnormal electrical activity in your temporal lobe, and the MRI revealed a small lesion in the same area." The word lesion hit me like a physical blow. A lesion? Like a tumor? "Not a tumor," Dr. Martinez said quickly. "What we're looking at is called a cavernous malformation, essentially a cluster of abnormal blood vessels in your brain. It's about the size of a small grape, located in the hippocampus region of your left temporal lobe." Marcus squeezed my hand tighter. "Is it dangerous?" "It can be," Dr. Martinez said, pulling up images on her computer screen. "Cavernous malformations can cause seizures, memory problems, and in some cases, bleeding. The good news is that yours appears stable, no recent bleeding or significant growth. The challenging news is that it's located in a very delicate area responsible for memory formation and retrieval." I stared at the brain scan on her screen, trying to process that the small, dark spot she was pointing to was inside my head, affecting my ability to remember my own life. So, all those memory lapses? The blackouts? Were likely a form of seizure called temporal lobe epilepsy. The electrical disturbances in that area of your brain can cause exactly the symptoms you've been experiencing: memory gaps, feelings of déjà vu, unusual tastes or smells, and periods of altered consciousness where you might function but not form new memories. Relief flooded through me so intensely I almost started crying. After months of being told I was attention-seeking or dramatic, here was concrete proof that something real was wrong with my brain. Can it be treated? Yes, but we need to discuss options carefully. We can start with anti-seizure medications to control the electrical activity. However, given the location and your symptoms, we should also consult with our neurosurgical team about the possibility of surgical removal. The word surgery sent a chill through the room. Marcus shifted in his chair. "Brain surgery?" "It's not as scary as it sounds," Dr. Martinez said. "Dr. James Patterson, our chief neurosurgeon, specializes in these types of procedures. He's removed hundreds of cavernous malformations with excellent outcomes. But surgery isn't always necessary. We'll try medications first and see how you respond." She prescribed an anti-seizure medication called levetiracetam, explaining that it might take several weeks to reach therapeutic levels in my system. "You might experience some side effects initially: fatigue, mood changes, slight cognitive fogginess. These usually improve as your body adjusts." Walking out of that appointment, I felt like I was carrying a grenade in my purse. Not the prescription bottle, but the knowledge of what was happening inside my head. I had a name for my condition, a treatment plan, and validation that my symptoms were real. But I also had to face my family with this information. I called Emma first, reaching her during her lunch break at school. "I just came from the neurologist," I said without preamble. "They found something called a cavernous malformation in my brain. It's been causing seizures that affect my memory." "A what?" I explained Dr. Martinez's findings, reading directly from the notes that I had taken during the appointment. Emma listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. "So, you're saying you actually have a medical condition?" "Yes. A serious one that might require brain surgery." Another pause. "Julie, I owe you an apology. I thought..." She trailed off, then started again. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. This must have been terrifying going through this alone."
Her apology felt good, but also highlighted how isolated I had been. It was terrifying, especially when everyone kept telling me I was making it up. "What can I do to help?" Emma asked, and for the first time in months, she sounded like the big sister who had protected me from playground bullies and helped me with homework. My mother's reaction was more complicated. I found her in the break room of the surgical unit, still wearing her scrubs from a long shift. She looked exhausted, her graying hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, but her expression sharpened when she saw me. "I heard you've been making appointments with our neurologists," she said before I could speak. "Word travels fast in a hospital." "Mom, they found something," I said, sitting across from her at the small table. "A cavernous malformation in my temporal lobe. It's been causing seizures." I watched her face carefully as I explained the diagnosis. Her medical training was evident in how quickly she processed the information, but something else flickered across her expression. Guilt, maybe, or recognition? "How long have you been having the metallic tastes?" she asked suddenly. "A few months?" "Why?" She was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee absently. "Your grandmother had temporal lobe epilepsy. My mother. It wasn't diagnosed until she was in her 50s, back when they didn't understand these things as well. She described the same metallic tastes, the same feelings of dread before episodes."
This was information she had never shared, despite months of my describing identical symptoms. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I hoped it wasn't genetic, because I didn't want you to go through what she did." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She had surgery in 1987 to remove a lesion. It helped, but the recovery was difficult. Medical techniques are much better now, but you were scared," I finished. She nodded. "I was scared, and I convinced myself that if I didn't acknowledge the possibility, it wouldn't be true. When you started having symptoms, I thought if I dismissed them, they might go away." Understanding her motivation didn't erase the months of feeling alone and dismissed, but it provided context. "I start medication tomorrow," I said. "If it doesn't work, they might recommend surgery." "Dr. Patterson is excellent," she said, her nurse persona taking over. "If it comes to surgery, you couldn't be in better hands." The medication changes were gradual but noticeable. Within 2 weeks of starting levetiracetam, the frequency of my memory episodes decreased dramatically. I could work full days without losing time, have complete conversations without forgetting what we had discussed mid-sentence, and drive places without ending up somewhere I didn't remember going. But the side effects were challenging. I felt constantly fatigued, as if I were thinking through a thick fog. Tasks that had once been easy required enormous concentration. At work, I found myself reading the same paragraph multiple times to absorb its meaning. Simple calculations that I could previously do in my head required a calculator and careful double-checking. Michael Chen, my supervisor, noticed the changes. "You seem different lately," he said during our weekly check-in meeting. "More deliberate in how you approach things." "I've been dealing with a medical issue," I said carefully. "Temporal lobe epilepsy. The medication that controls it affects my cognitive speed, but my memory is much more reliable now." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "That explains a lot, actually. You've seemed much more consistent lately, even if you're working a bit slower. Consistency is more valuable than speed in our line of work." His understanding response was another small victory, but it also highlighted a new challenge. The medication was controlling my seizures, but it was changing who I was in subtle ways. I felt less sharp, less quick-witted, more careful and methodical in everything I did. Marcus noticed the changes too. "You're different," he said one evening as we walked around the American River Parkway, watching joggers and cyclists pass by on the trail. "Not bad different, just different." "Different how?" I asked, though I suspected I knew.
Before, your mind moved so fast I could barely keep up with your thoughts. You'd jump from topic to topic, make these brilliant connections between seemingly unrelated things. Now you're more grounded, I guess, more present. Do you miss how I was before? The question scared me, but I needed to know. He stopped walking and turned to face me. I miss knowing that your memories are reliable. I miss not worrying about whether you'll remember our conversations. The other stuff, I'm still figuring out how I feel about it. His honesty was both painful and appreciated. The medication was giving me back my memory and my safety, but it was also changing fundamental aspects of my personality. I was facing a question I had never expected to confront. Which version of myself was the real Julie missed? 3 months into the medication regimen, I had my follow-up appointment with Dr. Martinez. The EEG showed dramatic improvement. No seizure activity detected during the monitoring period. But when she asked about my quality of life, I had to be honest about the cognitive effects. The memory problems are almost completely resolved, but I feel like I'm thinking through molasses. My work performance is consistent, but slow. I'm wondering if we need to adjust the dosage or try a different medication. Dr. Martinez reviewed my charts, noting the successful seizure control against the cognitive side effects. We could try reducing the dose slightly, but that might allow breakthrough seizures. Or we could discuss the surgical option again. Removing the cavernous malformation could potentially eliminate both the seizures and the need for long-term medication. Surgery, the option that had terrified me 3 months earlier, now seemed like a path back to myself. Tell me more about what surgery would involve, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. For the first time since this journey began, I was ready to fight for more than just symptom control. I was ready to fight for my mind. The consultation with Dr. James Patterson was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October. I had requested the day off work, telling Michael only that I had an important medical appointment. The neurosurgery department occupied an entire floor of the medical center, and walking through those hallways felt like entering a different world, one where people made decisions about opening skulls and touching brains as routinely as I reviewed environmental impact reports. Dr. Patterson was not what I had expected. Tall and lanky with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he looked more like a philosophy professor than someone who performed brain surgery. His office was filled with medical journals, anatomical models, and photographs of patients at various stages of recovery. What struck me most was how he listened, not just to my words, but to the pauses between them, the way I gestured when describing my symptoms, the subtle changes in my voice when I talked about my fears. "Tell me about your life before the seizures," he said, settling back in his chair. "What were you like? What did you love doing?" It was an unusual question for a surgeon, but I found myself describing the Julie who had existed before the memory lapses began. I talked about late-night research sessions that felt like detective work, the thrill of connecting environmental data points to solve complex puzzles, the way my mind could hold multiple variables simultaneously and see patterns others missed. "And now?" he asked. "Now I feel like I'm operating at half capacity," I admitted. "The medication controls the seizures, but it's like someone dimmed the lights in my brain. I can still do my work, but the joy is gone. The creative connections that used to come naturally now feel forced and artificial." Dr. Patterson nodded, pulling up my brain scans on a large monitor. The cavernous malformation is located in a region we call the hippocampus. This is essentially your brain's memory center, but it's also involved in learning, spatial navigation, and what we might call cognitive flexibility, your ability to adapt your thinking and make creative connections. He showed me additional scans comparing my brain to normal examples. The malformation itself isn't large, but its location is causing electrical disruptions that affect a much wider area. Think of it like a pebble in a pond. The ripples extend far beyond the initial disturbance. What would surgery involve? Marcus asked. He had been quietly taking notes throughout the consultation, his engineering background making him naturally systematic about gathering information. We would perform what's called a temporal lobectomy. We'd make a small opening in the skull, carefully navigate to the malformation, and remove it along with a small amount of surrounding tissue to ensure we get all the abnormal blood vessels. The description sounded both routine and terrifying. What are the risks? With any brain surgery, there are risks of infection, bleeding, or adverse reactions to anesthesia, he said matter-of-factly. Specific to this procedure and location, there's a small risk of memory problems, language difficulties, or changes in personality. However, given that you're already experiencing significant memory issues and personality changes from both the seizures and the medication, surgery might actually improve your overall cognitive function. He pulled up a chart showing outcomes for similar procedures. In patients with cavernous malformations in this location, about 85% see complete resolution of seizures after surgery. About 70% are able to discontinue anti-seizure medications entirely within a year of the procedure. Those statistics represented more than numbers. They represented the possibility of getting my mind back. How long is the recovery? The immediate recovery is about a week in the hospital, followed by several weeks of limited activity at home. Most patients return to work within 6 to 8 weeks, though cognitive recovery can take longer. Some patients notice improvements in thinking and memory within days of surgery, while others see gradual improvements over several months. I left that appointment with a surgery packet thicker than to be a small book, consent forms, pre-operative instructions, recovery guidelines, and detailed explanations of every possible complication. But I also left with something else, hope that I could reclaim the person I had been before the seizures began. The decision to proceed with surgery wasn't made lightly. I spent weeks researching temporal lobectomies, reading medical journals, and patient testimonials. I joined online support groups for people with cavernous malformations, where I learned about others who had faced similar decisions. Some had chosen surgery and were thrilled with the results. Others had complications or disappointing outcomes. A few had chosen to remain on medication indefinitely. Emma surprised me by offering to attend one of my preoperative appointments. She sat quietly as Dr. Patterson's surgical coordinator, a nurse named Janet Walsh, explained the timeline and logistics of the procedure. The surgery itself takes about 4 to 6 hours, Janet explained. You'll be under general anesthesia for the entire procedure. Dr. Patterson uses advanced imaging to navigate to the exact location of the malformation, minimizing damage to healthy brain tissue. Will she be different afterward? Emma asked suddenly. I mean, will she still be Julie? It was a question I had been afraid to ask directly. Janet smiled gently. That's one of the most common concerns families have. The goal of the surgery is to return Julie to who she was before the seizures began. We're not removing healthy brain tissue. We're removing abnormal blood vessels that are disrupting normal brain function. But even with reassurances, the weight of the decision was enormous. I was choosing to let someone open my skull and operate on my brain based on the hope that it would restore abilities I might have lost forever anyway. Marcus struggled with the decision too. I love you the way you are now, he said one evening as we sat in my apartment, the surgery consent form spread across my coffee table. You're calmer, more present. Sometimes I think the medication Julie might be better for our relationship than the pre-seizure Julie. His comment stung, but I understood what he meant. The version of me that existed on anti-seizure medication was less intense, less driven, more content with simple pleasures. She didn't stay up until midnight researching obscure environmental regulations or get frustrated when others couldn't follow her rapid-fire thought processes. But that's not really me, I said. That's me with my brain chemistry artificially altered. Don't you want to be with the real Julie? I want to be with the Julie who's happy and healthy. If surgery gives you that, then I support it. But if the medication does that, I support that too. My mother's perspective was different. Having lived through her own mother's brain surgery, she understood both the potential benefits and the very real risks. Grandmother was never quite the same after her surgery, she told me during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. She was better in many ways, no more seizures, no more memory problems, but she lost some of her edge, her sharpness. She said it was worth it, but I always wondered if she really meant that, or if she was just making the best of what she had left. Are you saying I shouldn't have the surgery? I'm saying you need to be realistic about what you might gain and what you might lose. Surgery isn't magic. It won't necessarily give you back exactly who you were before. Despite these concerns, I found myself increasingly committed to the surgical option. The medication had given me stability, but it hadn't given me back my life. I wanted to wake up in the morning excited about the day ahead, not just grateful that I could remember the previous day. I wanted to read complex environmental reports and see the connections that others missed. I wanted to feel like myself again, even if that self came with some level of seizure risk. The final factor in my decision was my work. Michael had been supportive and accommodating, but I could see the limitation my cognitive slowness placed on our projects. Environmental law required quick thinking and creative problem solving. Communities affected by pollution needed advocates who could process complex information rapidly and develop innovative legal strategies. I've decided to have the surgery, I told Dr. Martinez during my final preoperative appointment. I understand the risks, but I can't continue living as a diminished version of myself. She nodded approvingly. I think you're making a good decision, Julie. Your seizures are well controlled now, which puts you in an excellent position for surgery. Dr. Patterson will be operating on a calm brain, not one that's actively having seizures. The surgery was scheduled for November 15th, a Tuesday. As the date approached, I felt a strange combination of excitement and terror. I was about to voluntarily undergo a procedure that either restore my cognitive abilities or potentially leave me with permanent deficits. But for the first time since this journey began, I felt like I was fighting for myself, rather than just managing symptoms. I was choosing to pursue the life I wanted, rather than accepting the limitations imposed by my condition. The night before surgery, I sat at my computer and wrote letters to my family, to Marcus, and to my colleagues, explaining my decision and my hopes for the outcome. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about dissatisfaction with who I had become, but about reclaiming who I had always been. Tomorrow, I would find out if it was possible to get my mind back. I arrived at UC Davis Medical Center at 5:30 a.m. on November 15th. The sky still dark and the parking lot nearly empty except for the cars of night shift workers heading home. Marcus carried my overnight bag while I clutched the folder containing my advance directives, insurance cards, and the letters I had written the night before. My stomach churned with a mixture of pre-surgical anxiety and the knowledge that I hadn't been allowed to eat anything since midnight. The preoperative area was a maze of curtained spaces, each containing a patient preparing for various procedures. A cheerful nurse named Rebecca checked me in, reviewing my medical history and confirming my identity with a series of questions that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. Date of birth? March 12th, 2001. What procedure are you having today? Left temporal lobectomy for cavernous malformation removal. Saying it out loud made it real in a way that months of preparation hadn't. Someone was about to open my skull and remove part of my brain. Dr. Patterson appeared at my bedside at exactly 7 a.m., looking remarkably alert for someone about to perform delicate brain surgery. He reviewed the surgical plan one final time, using a marker to draw on my head where the incision would be made. Any last-minute questions? He asked, his manner both professional and reassuring. Will I know if something goes wrong during the surgery? I asked. It was a question that had been keeping me awake at night. You'll be completely unconscious, he assured me. If we encounter any unexpected complications, we have protocols in place. The most important thing is that we can monitor your brain function throughout the procedure using advanced imaging. We'll only proceed if everything looks safe. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Kim Park, introduced herself and explained the process of going under. You'll feel sleepy within seconds of the medication starting, she said. The next thing you'll know, you'll be waking up in recovery.
As they wheeled my gurney toward the operating room, I caught sight of my family in the waiting area. Emma had taken the day off from teaching, my mother was there despite working a double shift the night before, and even my father had driven up from San Diego. Marcus walked alongside the gurney as far as he was allowed, squeezing my hand until we reached the restricted area. "I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll be here when you wake up." The operating room was smaller than I had expected, filled with monitors, surgical instruments, and a team of people whose faces were hidden behind masks. They transferred me to the surgical table, and Dr. Park placed a mask over my face. "Count backward from 10, she instructed. 10, 9, 8. The world faded to black. I woke up to the sound of machines beeping and the sensation of something covering half my head. My throat was raw, my mouth dry as sandpaper, and there was a dull, aching pain where I assumed my incision was located. But I was awake, and I was aware enough to recognize that I was awake. "Julie?" A voice called my name, and I managed to open my eyes. A recovery room nurse was standing beside my bed, checking monitors. "How are you feeling?" "Thirsty," I croaked, surprised by how weak my voice sounded. "That's normal. The surgery went very well. Dr. Patterson will be by to see you shortly." The next few hours passed in a haze of pain medication and brief moments of consciousness. Family members appeared and disappeared at my bedside, their faces showing relief mixed with concern. Marcus held my hand and told me repeatedly that I was okay, that everything had gone according to plan. Dr. Patterson visited that evening, his surgical scrubs replaced by a regular white coat. "The surgery was successful," he reported. "We removed the entire cavernous malformation and a small amount of surrounding tissue. There was no unexpected bleeding, and all your neurological functions remained stable throughout the procedure." "How long until I know if it worked?" I asked, my words still slightly slurred from the anesthesia and pain medication. "Some patients notice improvements immediately, others take weeks or months. Your brain needs time to heal and adapt to the changes we've made. We'll gradually reduce your anti-seizure medication over the next several months and monitor how you respond." The first few days in the hospital were challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. The physical recovery was manageable. The incision pain was controlled with medication, and the swelling was minimal. But the cognitive effects were alarming. I felt confused and disoriented, unable to follow conversations or remember what had happened from hour to hour. "Is this normal?" Emma asked Dr. Patterson during his morning rounds on the third day post-surgery. I had just spent 10 minutes unable to remember her name, despite recognizing her face. "Post-operative cognitive confusion is very common after brain surgery," he explained. "Julie's brain is healing from the procedure. The swelling and inflammation will decrease over the next week or two, and her thinking should become clearer." But as the days passed, I began to worry that the surgery had caused more problems than it had solved. I couldn't concentrate long enough to read a magazine article. Simple math problems that should have been automatic required enormous effort. When Marcus brought me puzzle books to help pass the time, I stared at word searches that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. "What if I made a mistake?" I asked my mother during one of her visits. She was back in her nurse mode, adjusting my pillows and checking my incision site with professional competence. "It's too early to judge," she said firmly. "Recovery from brain surgery isn't linear. You might have good days and bad days for months." The breakthrough came on my 6th day in the hospital. I woke up that morning and immediately noticed something different. The mental fog that had clouded my thinking since surgery had lifted significantly. When the breakfast tray arrived, I was able to read the entire menu and make a decision about what to eat without feeling overwhelmed. Dr. Martinez visited that afternoon for a neurological assessment. She had me perform various cognitive tests, repeating sequences of numbers, naming objects, following complex instructions. For the first time since surgery, I felt like my responses were crisp and accurate. "This is very encouraging," she said, making notes in my chart. "Your cognitive function appears to be returning to baseline, possibly even better than your pre-surgery levels." The most significant test came when Marcus brought my laptop to the hospital. I had been avoiding work-related tasks, afraid that my environmental law skills had been permanently damaged by the surgery. But that evening, I opened an email from Michael containing a complex water rights case that had just come into the office. As I read through the details, agricultural water allocations, municipal usage data, endangered species habitat requirements, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. The information clicked into place like puzzle pieces, and I could see connections and patterns that weren't immediately obvious from the surface data. I spent 2 hours drafting a preliminary analysis, outlining potential legal strategies and identifying key environmental concerns that would need to be addressed. When I finished, I felt mentally tired, but satisfied in a way that the medication had never allowed. Marcus found me at the laptop, typing rapidly. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like myself," I said, looking up at him with what must have been a huge grin. For the first time in over a year, I feel like myself. But even as I celebrated this cognitive breakthrough, a new concern was emerging. The reduction in my anti-seizure medication had begun, and Dr. Martinez had warned me that there was a window of vulnerability as my brain adjusted to functioning without pharmaceutical support. "We will decrease your dosage by 25% every 2 weeks," she had explained. "If you experience any seizure activity, we'll slow down the tapering process." The first medication reduction went smoothly. My thinking became even clearer, and I felt more like the person I had been before the seizures began. But as we approached the second reduction, I began experiencing symptoms that worried me. Brief moments of déjà vu, occasional metallic tastes, and fleeting feelings of anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere. I was discharged from the hospital 8 days after surgery, with strict instructions to avoid driving, limit physical activity, and monitor for any signs of seizure activity. My head was still partially shaved and covered with surgical tape, making me look like a character from a science fiction movie, but I felt more optimistic about my future than I had in months. The optimism was short-lived. 3 weeks after surgery, while working from home on a pollution case involving a contaminated aquifer, I experienced my first post-surgical seizure. It wasn't like the memory lapses I had experienced before. This was a full convulsive seizure that left me unconscious on my living room floor. Marcus found me 20 minutes later, disoriented and confused, with a bleeding cut on my forehead from hitting the coffee table. The ambulance ride back to UC Davis Medical Center felt like a devastating step backward. "Sometimes it takes longer for the brain to stabilize after surgery," Dr. Patterson explained in the emergency room. "This doesn't mean the surgery failed, but it does mean we need to be more cautious about reducing your medication." As I lay in the hospital bed for the second time in a month, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. The surgery had restored my cognitive abilities, but the seizures weren't gone. I was caught between the person I wanted to be and the medical reality of my condition. For the first time since this journey began, I questioned whether the fight was worth continuing.
The second hospitalization was different from the first. Instead of the hopeful anticipation that had surrounded my surgery, this visit was shrouded in disappointment and fear. The post-surgical seizure had shattered my confidence that the operation had solved my problems, and the cut on my forehead served as a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. Dr. Patterson found me in the neurology unit the morning after my seizure, reviewing my latest EEG results with a furrowed brow. The good news is that the seizure activity is very different from what we saw before surgery, he said, pulling up brain scans on the bedside monitor. The electrical disturbances are much more localized and less intense. "But I still had a seizure," I said flatly. "Doesn't that mean the surgery failed?" "Not necessarily. What we're seeing now is likely related to post-surgical scarring and inflammation as your brain heals. It's not uncommon for patients to experience seizures in the first few months after temporal lobectomy, especially when we're reducing medication." He adjusted his glasses and pointed to specific areas on the scan. The cavernous malformation is completely gone. The tissue we removed showed no signs of abnormal blood vessels. But surgery creates changes in brain tissue, and sometimes those changes trigger temporary electrical instability. Dr. Martinez joined our conversation, carrying a thick folder of test results. "We're going to adjust your medication regimen," she announced. "Instead of continuing to reduce the levetiracetam, we're going to add a second anti-seizure medication temporarily. This should give your brain more time to stabilize while maintaining the cognitive improvements you've experienced." The new medication was called lamotrigine, and unlike levetiracetam, it was known for having minimal cognitive side effects. Some patients actually report improved mood and mental clarity on lamotrigine, Dr. Martinez explained. "It might be the best of both worlds, seizure control without the mental fogginess you experienced before surgery." I was discharged 2 days later with a new medication schedule and strict instructions to avoid being alone for the next month. Emma volunteered to stay with me during the day while Marcus was at work, transforming my apartment into a makeshift recovery center, complete with seizure precautions and emergency contact lists. The first week on the new medication regimen was challenging. My body was adjusting to the lamotrigine while still processing the reduced levetiracetam, creating a period of instability that left me feeling anxious and uncertain. I experienced frequent headaches, mood swings, and moments of confusion that reminded me uncomfortably of my pre-surgery symptoms. "What if this never gets better?" I asked Emma one afternoon as we sat on my couch, ostensibly watching a cooking show, but really just passing time. "What if I'm stuck taking multiple medications for the rest of my life, never knowing when another seizure might happen?" Emma set down her tea and looked at me seriously. "Then we'll figure out how to make that work. But you're not the same person who had seizures before surgery. You're thinking clearly, you're remembering conversations, you're working again. Even if you need medication, you're still you." Her perspective helped, but it didn't eliminate my frustration. I had risked brain surgery hoping to regain complete control over my mind and body, only to find myself dependent on pharmaceutical management in a different way. The cognitive improvements were undeniable, but the continued seizure risk felt like an incomplete victory. The breakthrough came during my 4th week of recovery in the most unexpected way. I was working from home on a complex case involving groundwater contamination from agricultural pesticides, trying to trace the connection between specific chemicals and contamination patterns in 3 counties. The data was enormous. Thousands of water quality measurements, agricultural usage reports, and geological surveys spanning 15 years. Before my surgery, this type of analysis would have taken weeks of methodical work, even with my pre-seizure cognitive abilities. During my medication-only period, it would have been nearly impossible. But as I worked with the new combination of medications, something remarkable happened. I found myself processing information faster and more efficiently than I had ever had before. Patterns emerged from the data that I could see almost intuitively. Connections between seemingly unrelated factors became obvious. Within 6 hours, I had developed a comprehensive analysis that normally would have taken days or weeks to complete. When I called Michael to discuss my findings, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Julie, this is extraordinary work. The connections you've identified could be the foundation for a major lawsuit against 3 pesticide manufacturers. How long did this take you to put together?" "About 6 hours," I said, still somewhat amazed by my own productivity. 6 hours? His voice rose in disbelief. "I've seen experienced environmental lawyers take months to develop this level of analysis. Are you sure you're okay? This seems almost too good to be true." His comment made me pause and consider what had just happened. Not only was I thinking clearly, but I was thinking better than I ever had before. The surgery had removed the source of electrical disruption in my brain, and the new medication was providing seizure protection without cognitive interference. The result was mental performance that exceeded even my pre-seizure baseline. I called Dr. Martinez to discuss this development. She said it's not uncommon for patients to experience cognitive improvements after successful temporal lobectomy. Removing the source of electrical disruption can actually enhance brain function in the surrounding areas. Think of it like removing static from a radio signal. Suddenly, everything comes through more clearly. But why didn't this happen immediately after surgery?
Your brain needed time to heal and adapt. The combination of post-surgical recovery and medication optimization has created ideal conditions for enhanced cognitive function. You're essentially experiencing your brain's full potential without the interference of seizure activity. This explanation was both thrilling and daunting. If this level of mental performance was sustainable, it would transform not just my recovery, but my entire career trajectory. But I was also aware that I was only 1 month post-surgery, and my seizure history made me cautious about celebrating too early. The real test came when I returned to the office for the first time since my surgery. Michael had arranged for me to work reduced hours initially, but when I walked into the familiar environment of case files, legal briefs, and environmental reports, I felt a surge of excitement I hadn't experienced in over a year. My colleagues welcomed me back with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Most knew I had undergone brain surgery, but the details of my condition had remained private. Some seemed surprised by how normal I appeared, while others watched me carefully for signs of cognitive impairment. Within days, it became clear that not only was I functioning normally, but I was functioning at a level that impressed even experienced attorneys. Complex cases that had been stalled during my absence moved forward rapidly as I identified solutions and strategies that had previously been overlooked. Sarah Chen, one of the senior attorneys, pulled me aside after a particularly productive strategy meeting. "I don't know what kind of surgery you had, but you're thinking at a level I've never seen before. It's like someone upgraded your brain's operating system." Her comment was more accurate than she realized. The surgery had essentially done exactly that, removing interference and optimizing function in ways that exceeded my natural baseline. But even as I celebrated these cognitive improvements, the seizure risk remained a constant background concern. Dr. Martinez had been clear that the first 6 months post-surgery were critical for determining long-term seizure control. Every day without a seizure was progress, but it wasn't a guarantee. The psychological adjustment was as challenging as the medical one. I was learning to trust my brain again, to rely on mental abilities that had been unreliable for over a year. Simple tasks like driving alone or working late hours required conscious decisions about acceptable risk levels. Marcus noticed the changes in both my capabilities and my confidence. "You're different again," he observed one evening as we walked through downtown Sacramento, passing the coffee shop where my first memory lapse had occurred nearly a year earlier. "Not just better than you were on medication, but better than you were before any of this started." "Is that a good thing?" I asked, remembering his earlier ambivalence about my personality changes. "It's incredible," he said without hesitation. "You're still you, but you're like the best possible version of yourself. Sharper, more focused, but also more confident and less anxious than you used to be." His observation was accurate. The experience of facing a serious neurological condition, undergoing brain surgery, and emerging with enhanced abilities had fundamentally changed my relationship with my own mind. I no longer took cognitive function for granted, and I approached mental challenges with both appreciation and determination that hadn't existed before my illness. 2 months post-surgery, Dr. Patterson declared my recovery ahead of schedule. "Your EEGs show no seizure activity, your cognitive function is excellent, and the surgical site has healed beautifully," he reported during my follow-up appointment. "We'll continue monitoring you closely, but all indicators suggest the surgery was a complete success." For the first time since this journey began, I allowed myself to believe that I had not just survived my medical crisis, but emerged stronger than before. 6 months after my surgery,
I stood in the conference room of our law firm, presenting findings to a packed audience that included state environmental regulators, community activists, and representatives from 3 major agricultural companies. The case I had developed, tracing pesticide contamination across multiple counties, had evolved into one of the largest environmental lawsuits in California history. The data clearly demonstrates a pattern of groundwater contamination that correlates directly with specific pesticide applications over a 15-year period, I explained, clicking through slides that represented months of analysis. What makes this case unique is our ability to trace contamination plumes to their exact sources, using geological modeling that previous investigations missed. In the audience, I spotted Dr. Martinez and Dr. Patterson, whom I had invited to see the results of their medical intervention. 6 months earlier, I had been a patient struggling with memory loss and cognitive decline. Now, I was leading a legal strategy that could protect thousands of people from environmental contamination. The presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause. But the real validation came afterward, when the lead state regulator approached me privately. "Miss Mist, this analysis is groundbreaking," she said. "We'd like to discuss having you consult on similar cases throughout the state. Your methodology could revolutionize how we investigate agricultural contamination." As the conference room emptied, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The memory lapses that had started in a Target store had led to a medical odyssey that ultimately enhanced rather than diminished my capabilities. What my family had dismissed as attention-seeking behavior had been the early symptoms of a serious neurological condition that, once properly treated, unlocked cognitive potential I never knew I possessed. Michael Chen joined me as I packed up my presentation materials. "Julie, I have something to discuss with you," he said, his tone unusually formal. "The partners have been talking, and we'd like to offer you a promotion to senior associate. We're also creating a new position, Director of Advanced Environmental Analysis, specifically designed around your unique analytical abilities." The promotion represented more than career advancement. It was recognition that my medical journey had transformed me into a more valuable professional than I had been before my illness. The brain surgery that I had feared might end my career had actually accelerated it. That evening, Marcus and I celebrated at the same Sacramento restaurant where we had our first date 3 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was commemorating professional success that directly resulted from a medical crisis that had nearly destroyed my life. "Do you ever regret going through all of this?" Marcus asked as we shared dessert, his question referring not just to the surgery but to the entire year-long ordeal. I considered his question carefully. The journey had been terrifying, painful, and isolating. I had experienced months of self-doubt, family conflict, and medical uncertainty. But it had also led to discoveries about my own resilience, the importance of advocating for myself, and capabilities I might never have developed otherwise. I said, "I regret the suffering. I regret the time lost and the relationships strained. But I don't regret where it led me. This version of myself, cognitively enhanced, professionally confident, medically stable, might not have existed without the crisis that forced me to fight for my brain." The conversation turned to our future together. Marcus had proposed 2 weeks earlier, presenting me with a ring during a hiking trip to the same Folsom Lake trails where he worked as a ranger. Our relationship had survived the stress of my medical crisis and emerged stronger, built on a foundation of mutual support during genuine adversity.
I want you to know that I fell in love with every version of you. The pre-seizure Julie, the medicated Julie, and this enhanced post-surgery Julie. Your brain might have changed, but your heart never did. My relationship with my family had also transformed dramatically. Emma had evolved from a skeptical sister to one of my strongest advocates, using her teaching background to help me develop cognitive exercises during my recovery. She had also become an advocate for epilepsy awareness at her school, sharing our story, with my permission, to help other families recognize potential neurological symptoms in young people. My mother's journey was perhaps the most profound. The guilt she carried about initially dismissing my symptoms had motivated her to become involved in patient advocacy at the hospital. She now participates in training sessions for medical staff about the importance of taking young patients' neurological complaints seriously, regardless of family dynamics or previous medical history.
I failed you as both a mother and a medical professional, she had told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings that had replaced our previous tense phone calls. But watching you fight for your diagnosis and treatment taught me something important about advocacy and persistence. Even my father had found a way to contribute meaningfully to my recovery. His construction management background proved valuable when I needed accommodations for my home office during recovery, and his practical approach to problem solving helped me develop realistic strategies for managing seizure risk in daily life. The most unexpected outcome of my medical journey was its impact on my professional focus. The experience of being dismissed and disbelieved by medical professionals had given me new insight into the communities I served through environmental law. Many of the residents affected by pollution faced similar challenges: their health complaints dismissed, their concerns minimized, their expertise about their own bodies and environments overlooked by authorities. I began incorporating this perspective into my legal work, developing strategies that elevated community voices and insisted on taking residents' health reports seriously. The pesticide contamination case that had made my reputation was built on exactly this approach, believing community members who reported health problems and investigating their concerns with the same rigor I had demanded for my own medical symptoms. Dr. Martinez and I had developed an ongoing relationship that extended beyond typical doctor-patient boundaries. She invited me to speak at medical conferences about the patient experience of temporal lobe epilepsy, and I had become involved in research studies about cognitive outcomes after cavernous malformation surgery. Your case has informed our approach to dozens of other patients, she told me during one of my regular follow-up appointments. Your documentation of symptoms, your advocacy for proper testing, and your detailed recovery records have helped us identify patterns that improve our diagnostic and treatment protocols. The research component of my recovery had revealed that my experience was part of a larger pattern of young women with neurological symptoms being dismissed as attention-seeking or psychosomatic. Dr. Patterson had begun collecting data on diagnostic delays in women with cavernous malformations, and my case was contributing to advocacy for more aggressive early intervention. 1 year after my surgery, my seizure-free status allowed Dr. Martinez to begin reducing my medication again. This time, the process was gradual and carefully monitored, with each dosage reduction accompanied by detailed neurological testing. The goal was to determine whether the surgery had provided complete seizure control or whether I would need some level of medication management for life. Even if you need to remain on a low dose of medication indefinitely, Dr. Martinez explained, your cognitive function and quality of life are excellent. You've achieved the best possible outcome from both the surgery and the medication management. The prospect of lifelong medication no longer frightened me as it once had. I had learned to view it as a tool for optimizing my brain function rather than a limitation on my capabilities. The enhanced cognitive abilities I had developed post-surgery were sustainable with or without pharmaceutical support. My work continued to expand in scope and impact. The methodologies I had developed for environmental contamination analysis were being adopted by law firms and regulatory agencies across the country.
I had been invited to testify before congressional committees and speak at international conferences about innovative approaches to environmental protection. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the message I could offer to others facing similar medical challenges. I had created a blog documenting my journey from initial symptoms through recovery, which had attracted thousands of readers dealing with their own neurological conditions or advocating for family members whose symptoms were being dismissed. The central message was simple, but powerful. Your symptoms are real. Your concerns are valid. And proper medical care can not only restore your health, but potentially enhance your capabilities beyond their original baseline. The fight for accurate diagnosis and appropriate treatment is always worth the effort, regardless of how long it takes or how many people doubt your experience. Standing in my office one afternoon, looking out at the Sacramento skyline and reviewing case files that would protect communities from environmental harm, I realized that the memory loss my family had called attention-seeking had ultimately led me to become the person I was always meant to be, just by a much more circuitous and challenging route than I had ever imagined. The brain surgeon indeed had different news than my family expected, but the real revelation wasn't just that my symptoms were caused by a treatable medical condition. It was that surviving and overcoming that condition unlocked potential I never knew existed, transforming a medical crisis into the foundation for a more meaningful and impactful life than I had ever thought possible.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.